Before the serpent, before the garden, before the very concept of evil existed, there was him. He wasn't a monster hiding in the shadows, waiting to strike. He wasn't a warning. He was the light itself. To find the origin of all our nightmares, you don't look down into the pit of hell. You have to look up, staring directly into the blinding heart of heaven's brightest star. But perfection is a terrifyingly fragile thing. It doesn't shatter with the roar of a cannon. It cracks with a single, silent thought. To understand how the most beautiful entity in existence became the architect of humanity's destruction, we must unlock 4 doors. Door 1, the perfection. Door 2, the fracture. Door 3, the war of silence. And door 4, the exile. Stay with us, because what lies behind door 4 doesn't just explain the devil. It explains the terrifying fragility of your own soul. Imagine standing in a place where shadows are physically impossible. The air vibrates with a frequency so pure it feels like a heavy golden weight on your chest. In the center of this blinding radiance stands a figure that makes the sun look like a dying candle. This is Lucifer, the light bringer. In the earliest traditions, he wasn't born into chaos. He was the masterpiece of creation. Ancient texts describe him not as flesh and blood, but as a being shimmering with the living jewels of Eden: sapphire, onyx, topaz, and gold. He acted like a sentient prism, capturing the raw, terrifying power of the divine throne and refracting it into a spectrum of beauty that the human eye isn't evolved enough to process. He was the covering cherub, the guardian of the ultimate mystery, positioned so close to the absolute center of power that he breathed the same air as God. When he moved, it sounded like music. Some traditions say his very body was built of pipes and timbrels, that he didn't just sing the song of creation, he was the song. To look upon him was to feel instantly smaller, not out of fear, but out of an overwhelming, crushing reverence. But while the heavens sang, a catastrophe was already ticking beneath the surface. It didn't start with a scream. It didn't start with a sword drawn in anger. It started with a question that arrived like a drop of ink in a glass of clear water. Why not me? This is the moment the universe broke. Lucifer didn't lash out. He looked inward. He stood next to the throne, and for the first time, he didn't see a master to serve. He saw a seat to occupy. Why should eternity revolve around a single will? Why should he, the being who reflected the light so perfectly, be forced to only reflect it? Why couldn't he generate it? The shift was microscopic. On the outside, he was still the leader of the heavenly choir, his voice soaring with the same majestic harmonies that held the cosmos together. But on the inside, the center of gravity had moved. Imagine the sensation of ice water slowly spreading through your veins while you are forced to maintain a warm, benevolent smile. That was Lucifer. He was no longer serving the throne. He was measuring it. He was calculating the distance between where he stood and where he wanted to sit. And because no angel had ever fallen, no one knew what to look for. They saw a leader. They saw a brother. They didn't see the slow, agonizing unraveling of a mind consumed by its own brilliance. This is where the story turns into a psychological thriller. Lucifer didn't try to fight God with brute strength. He knew that was suicide. Instead, he weaponized the one thing no one saw coming: influence. Picture a crowded room where everyone is smiling, but one person is moving through the crowd, leaning in close, whispering something that changes the expression on every face he touches. Lucifer moved through the ranks of angels like a wind moving through tall grass, invisible but undeniable. He didn't force them to bow. He didn't use fear. He used charm. He used logic. He tapped into the hidden desires of celestial beings who had known nothing but obedience for eons. He offered them the one drug they had never tasted: choice. He planted the idea that the hierarchy wasn't a divine order, but a cage, and he held the key. Slowly, quietly, the harmony of heaven began to dissonate. One by one, angels turned their gaze from the throne to him. They saw a visionary. They saw a being who dared to ask the difficult questions. They didn't realize they were looking at the architect of their own eternal torment. The lines were being drawn, not in the sand, but in the hearts of the immortal host. The war was coming, but the first casualty had already fallen. Truth was dead, and the lie was just beginning to breathe. The Bible describes what happened next in 3 terrifying words: war in heaven. But if you are imagining a medieval battlefield with clashing steel and bloody armor, you are missing the true horror of what occurred. This wasn't a physical brawl. It was a collision of fundamental realities. Michael the archangel rose to meet the rebellion, not with a counter-argument or a debate, but with a weapon far more devastating: silence. Imagine the sound of 1,000 thunders screaming against a wall of absolute, immovable order. That was the war. Lucifer, twisted by a pride that had calcified into madness, threw everything he had at the throne: his brilliance, his music, his influence over 1/3 of the angelic host. But he had surrendered the one thing that made his power sustainable: submission. Without that connection to the source, his light didn't just fade, it began to burn him alive. The battle was brutal and grief-stricken, a civil war where brother turned against brother, and the very fabric of the spiritual realm tore apart under the weight of betrayal. And when the end came, it wasn't a negotiation, it was an eviction. Gravity in the spiritual realm works differently than on earth. Here, you fall when you lose your footing. But there, you fall when you lose your truth. Lucifer didn't just trip. He was expelled with the force of a cosmic detonation. He was cast down like lightning, a streak of corrupted glory ripping through the sky. Stop time for a second and picture that specific moment. The gates of heaven, massive and ancient, sealing shut behind him with the finality of a prison door slamming in an empty hall. His wings, once shimmering with the colors of sapphires and emeralds, ignited. They didn't just burn, they blackened, curling into ash and smoke as he plummeted through the void between worlds. He wasn't falling alone. 1/3 of the heavenly host, millions of beings who had once sung the harmonies of creation, fell with him, their screams echoing into a silence that had never been broken before. They were not traitors by nature, they were traitors by belief. They had bet on the wrong king, and now they were paying the price in a currency of fire and distortion. But the most disturbing part of this story isn't the fall itself. It's what crawled out of the crater. When the dust settled, the morning star was gone. In his place stood a being reshaped by the purest form of hate. Some traditions say he became monstrous, a horned beast smoldering with the heat of his own rage. But other, far more unsettling accounts suggest something worse, that he kept his beauty. Because evil, at its most effective, doesn't come dressed as a nightmare. It comes dressed as a dream you desperately want to believe. He was no longer Lucifer. That name was a relic of a dead past. He was now Ha-Satan, the adversary, the prosecutor, the opposer. And his followers? They became the first demons, twisted not just in form, but in function. They retained the memories of heaven, the structure, the glory, the feeling of home. And that memory became a torture device that fueled their bitterness. They were no longer heralds of the divine. They were instruments of a new, terrifying purpose. The war was over, but the invasion was just beginning. Lucifer realized something in the darkness of his exile. He could not storm the gates of heaven again. That door was locked forever. But he didn't need to defeat God to hurt him. He just needed to break what God loved most. He turned his gaze away from the throne and toward a small, fragile garden on a newly formed planet. He wouldn't build a kingdom of walls and towers. He would build a kingdom of lies. If he couldn't be God, he would become the God of those who refused him. He traded his sword for a whisper, his armor for a shadow, and prepared to commit the first act of terrorism in human history. He didn't need an army to destroy paradise. He just needed a serpent, a question, and a few seconds of hesitation. The stage was set for Eden, and the adversary was already smiling. Lucifer had fallen, but he was far from finished. His presence lingered like the acrid smoke of a fire that refused to die. What he had lost in position, he gained in a terrifying new purpose that led him not to a battlefield, but to the most delicate thing in the universe, the beginning of mankind. To understand the tragedy of our own history, you must walk through Door 3, the corruption. Imagine a place untouched by the concept of pain, a radiant garden where every leaf and breath pulsed with a divine harmony that we can no longer even comprehend. Man and woman walked without shame, their souls uncluttered by fear or the noise of separation. It was peace in its most innocent, fragile form, and it was here, in this absolute stillness, that the adversary struck. But he didn't come with thunder or armies. He came softly, silently, not as a monster, but as something clever, familiar, and disarming. Scripture describes a serpent more cunning than any other creature, a description that hints at a hybrid of beauty and intelligence cloaked in subtle power. Stop time for a moment and visualize the scene. There is no roar of a beast, only the soft rustle of movement through the grass. He didn't force his way in. He wasn't unwelcome. He didn't roar. He whispered. His weapon was not pain, it was suggestion, a simple question designed to act as a seed of doubt. Did God really say? He knew that a fracture in the soul doesn't begin with rebellion. It begins with hesitation. Once that hesitation took root, desire followed. Desire for knowledge, for power, for more. Eve listened, and in time Adam followed, and with that single act, the purity of Eden was undone. It wasn't about the fruit, it was about the mistrust. The moment trust was broken, the bond between creator and creation unraveled. And for the first time in history, eyes opened not to wisdom, but to the crushing weight of disobedience. This was not a victory measured in violence, but in silence, in the subtle cracking of something once whole. Lucifer, now fully cast in the role of Satan, had drawn first blood in humanity's story, not by conquering earth, but by corrupting the one thing heaven had made in its image. He didn't need to seize power. He only needed to rewrite the first chapter. As the garden was sealed and humanity was cast out into a world that would soon know death, Satan smiled, not in triumph, but in deep, cold satisfaction. Heaven was closed to him forever, but earth had only begun to bleed. But while humanity struggled to survive, a catastrophe was already ticking beneath their feet, because the adversary wasn't just a tempter anymore. He was building a kingdom. In the earliest days of mankind, long after Eden had been sealed, strange currents began to run beneath the surface of the world. The first cities rose not in harmony, but in pride. The first blood was spilled not in justice, but in rage. Behind every fracture, every arrogant gesture, and every cruel decision, there was a shadow that lingered. He didn't conquer Earth by force. He colonized it by corruption, laying down a framework of distortion where truth was malleable and worship could be bought. Scripture calls him the God of this world, not in title, but in reach. He wasn't omnipresent, but he didn't need to be. The systems he planted, greed, fear, vanity, control, did the work for him. He offered alternatives to the divine, counterfeiting truth and slithering into temples to crown himself with different names. But the eyes behind the masks never changed. Nowhere is this transformation more disturbingly clear than in the book of Job. Here, Satan stands not as a beast or a monster, but as a lawyer in a courtroom, an accuser permitted to speak in heaven's court. He doesn't lash out. He poses a devastating, logical question. Does Job fear God for nothing? It was a challenge not of strength, but of intent, casting righteousness as a transaction and goodness as a means to a reward. This was the shape of his deception. He learned that the most effective lies aren't bold, they are plausible. He stopped breaking men with force and began unraveling them with questions and misleading logic. He blurred the line between freedom and rebellion, giving the proud praise, the fearful control, and the broken excuses. He didn't just oppose God. He redefined the terms of obedience, creating a kingdom that was a slow rot, a hidden hand, a voice not in thunder, but in thought. But as his influence grew, a rival was approaching who would challenge him not with a question, but with an answer. In all of Scripture, there is no rivalry more profound, nor more misunderstood, than that between Lucifer and Christ. One is the Word made flesh, the light that no darkness could overcome. The other is the light that turned inward, the brilliance that broke. They are not equals, and they are not siblings. They are roles that collide, justice and accusation, the shepherd and the wolf. Their paths finally crossed, not in the throne room of heaven, but in the deafening silence of a desert wilderness. Imagine you are there. The heat is hallucinations-inducing, the air is dry enough to crack skin, and Christ has gone 40 days without food. His body is weak, his ribs are showing, and it is here, at the precise moment of maximum biological vulnerability, that Satan appears. He doesn't attack with a sword, he attacks with an if. If you are the Son of God. It wasn't hunger he preyed upon, it was identity. He offered food, then fame, then power, all the kingdoms of the world without the suffering of the cross. But where Adam failed in a garden of plenty, Christ stood firm in a wasteland of nothingness. Lucifer realized too late that he wasn't fighting a man, he was fighting the truth. But the adversary is nothing if not persistent. He retreated to the shadows and waited for a more opportune time, which arrived in the form of a broken man named Judas Iscariot. Satan didn't possess Judas with wild convulsions. He entered him through a quiet, whispered agreement, born of disappointment and greed. When Judas sold the Son of Man for silver, and when the hammer struck the nails on Golgotha, Lucifer believed he had finally won. He thought the cross was a defeat. He thought death had claimed the divine. But he was wrong. The cross wasn't a tomb, it was a trap. 3 days passed, and then something happened that no prince of darkness expected. The gates of hell didn't just open, they exploded. Ancient tradition tells us that Christ descended into the realm of the dead not as a victim, but as a conqueror. Lucifer, the eternal accuser, watched in horror as the chains shattered and the righteous souls, Adam, Eve, the prophets, were lifted out. He was humiliated not by force, but by mercy. He sought to rise above God, while Christ descended below all things to save them. One grasped at divinity and fell. The other released it and rose. Now we stand before door 4, the Erasure. For all his cunning, for all the millennia spent shaping human history from the shadows, Lucifer's story does not end in a glorious final stand. The book of Revelation is cold, uncompromising, and absolute. There is a moment foretold when he is released from the abyss for one final test, gathering the scattered and the proud for a war that never actually happens. We often picture a grand cosmic battle, a Star Wars finale between good and evil, but the truth is far more terrifying. Before a single sword is swung, fire rains down from heaven. There is no fight, there is only judgment. The voice that stirred rebellion across galaxies is silenced instantly. He is stripped of his titles, his purpose, and his power. He is cast into the lake of fire, which is not a kingdom he rules, but a cell where he is forgotten. His punishment is not just pain, it is erasure, a complete, eternal separation from the light he once reflected. The morning star doesn't burn out, he is simply deleted. Here is the twist that changes everything you think you know about evil. We often fear Lucifer because we see him as the opposite of God, a rival power fighting for the throne. But the irony is that Lucifer is the ultimate proof of God's authority. He is a creature who desperately wanted to be the protagonist of reality, to be the I am. But in his refusal to serve, he became the ultimate was. He wanted to be more than a servant, but ended up as nothing more than a tool used to test the hearts of men. And this mirror reflects back on us. That voice that whispered, "Why not me?" in the heart of the brightest angel, is the same voice that whispers in your moments of jealousy, ambition, and pride. It's the voice that says you are the center of the universe. The tragedy of Lucifer isn't that he was a monster, it's that he was beautiful, and he let that beauty convince him he didn't need the source that created him. So this leaves you with a binary choice, a question that determines the trajectory of your own life. Do you choose the path of the dragon, rising in pride, demanding to be served, and ending in isolation? Or do you choose the path of the Lamb, descending in humility, serving others, and rising in glory? You have to choose one, because as the story of the morning star proves, you cannot be your own God. If you want to survive the next chapter, where we explore the terrifying entities known as the Watchers, and the forbidden knowledge they brought to Earth, you need to hit that subscribe button. The war in heaven is over, but the war for your mind has just begun.